Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video I want to talk about Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence. And we're going to do that by looking at a 1980 article, a very influential article by the philosopher Alexander Nehamas. And what Nehamas is telling us in this article is that people who have thought that when Nietzsche writes about eternal recurrence, as he does with sort of increasing frequency in the later years of his active life, he is not talking about a cosmological hypothesis. So Nehamas tells us that although people have often read Nietzsche as somebody who believes that what happens with the universe is that it recurs again and again and again, like we have the world as it is now, but everything that happens now has already happened just like that, infinitely many times in the past, and it's going to recur eternally, infinitely many times in the future. That would be what the idea of eternal recurrence is, and that's what scholars or readers of Nietzsche in general, I suppose, have usually thought that Nietzsche meant when he talked about eternal recurrence. Now, what Nehamas is going to do, he is going to suggest to us that this is completely wrong and that we should read Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence in a wildly different way. So, let me try to explain what Nehamas' own interpretation of eternal recurrence in Nietzsche is. He thinks that instead of a cosmological claim, where Nietzsche says, oh, the world is going to return eternally the same and has already returned eternally the same. Instead of that, Nietzsche is actually affirming a hypothetical. So a claim of the form, if A, then B. And what he is claiming is that if my life were to return, right? If my life were to return, then it would have to return exactly the same, identical in every detail. So let's hear it again. What Nehamas tells us is that Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence is the following hypothetical. It is the claim that if my life were to return, then it would return identical in every detail. Nothing about it could be different. So this could be true, right? This if-then statement could be true even though no recurrence is taking place, right? So we don't even need to worry whether recurrence is taking place. And yeah, I mean, there are indications, especially in his notebooks, that Nietzsche was worrying about that question, that he was trying to sort of get a scientific answer to that. But okay, says Nehamas, well, that's not really essential, and maybe Nietzsche was a bit confused about that. What he needs in his philosophy is only this hypothetical. Okay, but why believe this hypothetical, right? Why believe that if my life were to return, it would have to return exactly the same in every detail? Well, Nehamas reconstructs Nietzsche's thinking starting from the will to power. And the way to think about the will to power, or this idea of the will to power, in this context at least, is that what something is has nothing to do with sort of intrinsic features that it has independently of everything else. What something is defined by this eternal struggle between powers that are trying to overcome each other. And so, what a thing is depends on its relationships to other things. And so what we have here is a picture, a sort of metaphysical picture, maybe that's a word we can use, a sort of metaphysical picture where identity is defined by relations, and so by a relation to the whole. And so everything is what it is because it has a particular place inside this bigger whole. And that would mean that if anything gets changed in this whole, right, then everything changes, right? If everything is defined by its exact position or its exact activity in this bigger whole, then if anything changes in the whole, well, all the things that make up the whole change as well. And so we get from this idea of the will to power, this idea that identity is a matter of struggle and interaction, we get to a strong form of holism, where something is what it is because of the whole it is part of, but even any change in the whole, no matter how insignificant, is going to change everything in it. right? And that holism is going to be crucial, because if I accept that holism, then I've got to accept this conditional form of eternal recurrence. Right now I have to accept the claim that if my life were to return, then it would have to return every element identical. Because any change in my life would make it a completely different life. It would change everything in my life. Even worse, or even stronger maybe, anything that changes also in my surroundings would make everything different about my life. Right? So if my life returns, then it has to return exactly the same, and in fact the entire world, including its most insignificant details, has to reappear in the exact same way. Now, given that sort of line of thought, we come to this hypothetical story about eternal recurrence, and Nehamas says, well, according to Nietzsche, there are only two ways to react to this insight. It is total despair or total exhilaration. Well, why is that? Here's Nehamas' story. He says, well, what this means is that if I accept any part of the whole, I have to accept all of it. And if I reject any part of the whole, I have to reject all of it. And these would be the two states of exhilaration and despair. And I think Nehamas is definitely onto something when he tells us that there is this holist motive in Nietzsche, which, for instance, makes it puzzling how something like judgment works. Right? If I make some judgment, let's say I make an ethical judgment. Let's say I make an ethical judgment about you. Right? I look at you, at what you're doing, and I say, that's really bad. What's happening? Well, I am judging you. I'm sort of rejecting what you're doing. I'm saying it's bad. It should have been different. But if that had been different, right, if your action had been different, then everything would have been different, including me, the one who is judging, and including this judgment itself. So there seems to be something self-undermining in judgment, and that's an important theme in Nietzsche that we get from holism. So at least to that extent, we can say Nehamas must be on the right track. I'm not so sure I see how this hypothetical idea about eternal recurrence would have to lead to total exhilaration or total despair. I mean, as sort of emotional attitudes. But okay, we'll bracket that. We'll let that slide, at least for the moment. Now, Nietzsche clearly thinks that eternal recurrence is not just some fact that we find, it is something that in a sense spurs us into action. Right? There's an imperative connected to it. We have to live in a certain way, maybe, or we have to sort of find a way to a relation that we can have to our own life and our own actions that fits this thought of eternal recurrence. Right? It's not just some theoretical insight. It's going to be the basis of a new way of living even. So what is that new way of living? How does that work? Well, here's what Nehamas tells us. He says, well, what we have to do now is we have to make ourselves into people that we would want to be again. Right? We would have to make ourselves into the kind of people who say, yes, I want to live my life again exactly the same. Right? I wouldn't want anything about it to be different. And Nehamas immediately points out that there seem to be two kind of problems with that. Right? If I try to live my life in such a way that I wouldn't want any part of it to be different, then first of all, I will soon recognize that I don't have as much control over my future as I would like to. I mean, things might be going on in my future that are hard for me to turn into how I would want them to be, in part because maybe of external circumstances, but also because I have already been formed to a large extent, and I can't sort of transform myself completely overnight. So that could be one kind of problem. The other problem is even more severe, which is that my past, it's already there, right? I have no control over it. I can't change it. If there are things in my past that I really would have preferred to be different, there's nothing I can do. So am I not doomed from the start to fail if I try to make my life such that I would want to live it again with no changes? Well, says Nehamas, here's what we can do. Right? We can't change what happened in the past, but we can change what it signifies or what it means. Because what it signifies or what it means, well, that's going to be determined by the whole. In particular, it's going to be determined by future parts of my life. Right? I can look back on my past and see where it has led me and maybe accept it because of that. So I've got to redeem the past by giving it a significance through my future actions. That's sort of the story, the sort of moral here, or the sort of imperative, like how we have to live. I've got to live in such a way that I can accept my entire past because it has led to this acceptable or maybe even great situation that I wholeheartedly sort of embrace. Now, Nehamas returns at this point to this holist motive. And he says, look, the kind of life that Nietzsche is envisioning for us is one of total coherence, right? It's the kind of life where everything hangs together, where nothing could have been different without everything having been different, such that if I embrace any part of my life, I embrace all of it. And he says, well, it's going to be really hard to live like that, right? It's going to be really hard to live in such a way that your life is totally coherent and nothing about it could be changed without changing everything. It's more like an ideal or a limiting case, right? But if you manage to do that, he says, then you would surely want eternal recurrence, right? If you could live your life in such a way that it's totally coherent, then you would want to live it again exactly the same without any changes, because any change would kind of destroy that. I couldn't really find the argument here in Nehamas' article, to be honest. I couldn't really find the argument from total coherence to wanting to have eternal recurrence. I mean, there definitely are other authors writing about Nietzsche who think that eternal recurrence is by itself a kind of frightful vision, right? Having to do the same thing again and again and again and again. How does total coherence, the fact that I can't change anything about my life without changing all of it, take away the frightening aspect of eternal recurrence? I don't know, right? So maybe I have a wholly coherent life, which is wholly terrible. Why would I want eternal recurrence? I couldn't really find that in Nehamas' article, so I'm flagging that as a potential issue. I have some other issues with it, which I would return to later at the end. Okay, Nehamas anyway pushes on and he says, look, the kind of model that we can have here for how Nietzsche wants us to live our life is that of the story character, right? In a good story, and I'm citing Nehamas now, in a good story, to change one action of one character would be to cause the story to fall apart, right? So this is the total coherence ideal in action. In a good story, to change one action of one character would be to cause the story to fall apart. So he says Nietzsche wants us to live like story characters. He wants us to live like the kind of people where everything that you do, as in a good book, makes a difference to the story, and you couldn't write it in any other way. And Nehamas believes that this leads to some problems, right? It leads to a problem because it doesn't seem like we live much like story characters. It leads to a problem because story characters can be very despicable. They can be people that we don't want to be, and so on. I'm also wondering what kind of stories Nehamas is reading, because it seems to me that he is presupposing a fairly specific kind of literature. I mean, the idea that any change in any action by any character would sort of make the story fall apart. Perhaps it kind of works for, let's say, a very lean Greek tragedy. I'm not really seeing it work for a sprawling postmodern Thomas Pynchon novel, or for that matter, for something like the Renaissance epic Orlando Furioso, or for Don Quixote, or for so many other pieces of literature. I mean, I don't think that this ideal of total coherence is generally recognized as an ideal in literature. And so what Nehamas seems to be doing is he seems to be saddling Nietzsche with this ideal and then pointing out that it's a bit of a problematic ideal. I agree that it's a problematic ideal. I'm not sure that we have been really sort of taught how to see it in Nietzsche. And that's in part because of the following. What Nehamas points out, and I think correctly, is that Nietzsche has this strong holist thought, right? The idea that any part of my life is going to be what it is because of everything, right? Because of the rest of my life, but even everything that is not my life, right? The entire universe is sort of implied in every part of that universe. So my life, or even a single act in my life, sort of carries with it the whole of reality. And I couldn't want to have that action or state or whatever without wanting the whole of reality. That seems to be right? I think Nehamas is on the right track there. That thought alone doesn't seem to carry any obvious imperatives with it, any obvious normative conclusions about how I ought to live my life. In particular, it doesn't seem to carry the normative conclusion that I ought to make my life a totally coherent story, for the simple fact that it already is totally coherent with everything else. I mean, how can you have a sort of metaphysics that implies the total coherence of everything, and then also have an imperative where you say, make your life coherent? I mean, it already is coherent. Okay, and so I think that Nehamas is saying something like, yeah, but you have to make it coherent on the level of meaning. Okay, but then that doesn't seem to follow from the whole. So I'm just not seeing how you can have this descriptive story about the universe and then have this norm following from it. And maybe Nehamas says more about that in other texts. I know that he has written a very well-known book about Nietzsche called Nietzsche Life as Literature. So I can very much imagine that he returns to this theme there and works it out in more detail. In the article on eternal recurrence, it's more thrown out as a suggestion, and there's not much of an argument. More crucially, and this is why in the end I remain very much unconvinced by Nehamas' reading of eternal recurrence. More crucially, on Nehamas' reading, eternal recurrence is completely irrelevant. The one thing that you need is this strong holist thought. The strong holist thought. One part of my life couldn't be different without everything being different. That's the thought that you need, to tell the entire story that Nehamas goes on to tell. Now you can sort of fancifully express this idea by saying, nothing about my life could have been different without everything else having been different. To put it into this sort of counterfactual form. You can do that. That's fine. This is a counterfactual form. There's no recurrence. It's still the same idea. No recurrence. I could bring in recurrence. I could say, well, if my life were to recur, then it would be, again, the same in every detail. I could express the holist thought that way, using recurrence, but it's completely optional. I could do the same thing using a counterfactual. I could do the same thing by just positing the holism. So recurrence seems to be optional. What's even more optional is the eternity. I mean, there's no point, according to Nehamas, that I'm making by adding eternally to this. If I say, if my life were to recur once, it would have to be the same. That's the same claim here. It plays the same role as if my life were to occur infinitely many times, it would have to be the same every time. It's the same, So the eternal aspect of the recurrence is also optional. So Nehamas is giving us a reading of eternal recurrence where it's not important that it's eternal and it's not important that it's recurrence. And I find that very hard to square with Nietzsche's texts. I mean, why would he keep talking about eternal recurrence when it's not about eternity and not about recurrence, but only about this strong holist thought that in affirming one thing I have to affirm the whole, and in denying one thing I have to deny the whole? I can't see it. It doesn't seem like a very plausible interpretation of what Nietzsche is trying to do with this thought of eternal recurrence. So, what is the right way to interpret that? I'm not sure. I hope to find out and tell you more about that in later videos.